while you can say that embodied conscious agents are highly improbable on naturalism, you can't say they're improbable on theism, precisely because you can't do divine psychology. There isn't any way that you can assert that this is highly improbable.
No.
Hans Halvorsen, who's in the Department of Philosophy at Princeton, he says some think fine-tuning is evidence for God, but in fact, the opposite is true. Why did this take you by surprise?
The reason I'm surprised is that Hans Halvorsen, whom I know personally, is a brilliant philosopher of quantum physics, and therefore I'm surprised that he would find these arguments persuasive. It almost seems as though he's not familiar with the best statements of...
Yeah, this is something that William Lane Craig does a lot. You'll see, I'll point it out in future videos if I make them, but you'll see in debates and in discussions with him, then he will often reframe statements made by his opponents in such a way that makes it sound like they're making some absurd claim. And he'll use this to cast doubt on their credibility or whether they understand it. A big part of his debate tactic is presenting himself as much more reasonable and educated than his opponent. Not just, I'm right, but like, oh, this person doesn't really seem like they know what they're talking about. Like, you might not want to trust them on this.
Indeed, the way Robin Collins formulates the argument, he doesn't even calculate the probability of fine-tuning. Rather, he argues that embodied conscious agents are vastly more improbable with respect to a single naturalistic, atheistic universe than they are relative to theism. Given theism, it is more probable that embodied conscious agents would exist than it is on an atheistic single universe hypothesis.
See, I would love to see those numbers and those calculations, because I can't imagine how you would calculate the probability of different universes under theism. How exactly do you calculate the probability that God will do one thing rather than another?
And what he says is that fine-tuning advocates are so focused on using this second principle as a premise that they fail to see that it needs explanation. That is, why is it the case that it's unlikely for an arbitrary universe to be conducive to life?
Now here is, again, one of these places where I'm baffled. I think, have you not familiarized yourself with the literature on fine-tuning?
Here it is again.
And the idea here is that the assumable range of values for these constants and quantities, that is to say, the values they could have consistent with the laws of nature, is so vast compared to the range of life-permitting values that they are, that it makes it enormously improbable that a life-permitting universe should exist.
Wow, this is really big. If Dr. Craig has figured out not only what life is, which itself is a huge open question, but he's also figured out what range of conditions under which life could exist, especially when we're talking about life that obeys different physical laws of nature, then he should publish something about this. This would be incredibly significant. There are entire fields of biochemistry and astrobiology who are working day and night to address these questions. We have one sample of what life could be like. We have no idea how broad life could be. We don't even know where you would draw the line for a definition of life. What even counts as life? Because if you want to say that life is just, say, complex information processing, then, sorry, but I just can't take Dr. Craig seriously when he says with confidence that he knows what ranges of universes in the space of all possible combinations of the constants of nature life could exist in. I mean, this is an absurd claim. Not to mention, of course, the fact that he just assumes that the constants of nature could have been any different, which there's no evidence for. Maybe they could be different. There are certain theories, obviously, like the multiverse, where they are different, but you can't just assume that they could take on any conceivable value. These types of arguments indicate a broader problem that you will see over and over in arguments for God, where there's so much implicit anthropocentrism smuggled in, where in our universe we observe, say, we observe stars and planets. We observe at least one specific instance of life. And so when we imagine spinning the dials and just generating a random universe, we think to ourselves, oh, well, would those constants permit stars? Would they permit planets? Or would they permit life? Well, I don't think so. So then I guess it would be an empty void. The problem with this is that it's constrained by what we know. It is a hopelessly parochial way to think about what could be. Everything, even down to something like information processing, might not be there in another universe. It might be something fundamentally different. There is nothing constraining what these universes could possibly be like. An easy way to see this is just to imagine that some, disembodied observers were given the set of physical constants that our universe started with. Now imagine them trying to figure out, just from those physical constants, that life would emerge on some random planet in one solar system in a galaxy almost 14 billion years after the beginning of the universe. It's absurd to imagine, number one, that you would actually be able to work out what any of these universes could produce, and number two, that these universes would only be able to produce the type of complexity that we see in our universe. And if they have laws that forbid the specific examples of structures and processes that we find in our universe, it means that they're empty. I want to drive this point home, but in order to do so, I have to take a quick digression that will make sense in a minute. But imagine that you have a deck of cards, right? Now, say somebody deals you a hand. Like you're at a casino or something and somebody deals you a hand. Now, if you're dealt just a seemingly random set of cards, you don't get three of a kind, you don't get a royal flush or anything like that, then nothing suggests in that hand that there was anything else at work except for random selection. The hand seems unimportant to you. It has no significance. Now, if you are dealt a royal flush, then you immediately think, wow, okay, maybe it's more likely now that, say, this deck wasn't shuffled, or the dealer is looking at the cards or cheating in some way. And the reason that you think that is not because a royal flush is any less likely than any other hand. Any hand is equally likely. But the reason you think that this hand requires some special explanation beyond a random set of cards is because we have imbued significance, a special order, into a royal flush hand. If we go back now and make this analogy to the universe, this, I think, is the fundamental error that fine-tuning arguments make, is that there is an assumption, an implicit assumption, that our universe has this special significance, that it's different from other universes, that the order or the complexity of our universe is special. Now, this is the problem, is that the idea that the type of interactions and complex processes and systems that we find in our universe is in any way special or better than what you'd get from other universes is completely baseless. And again, it is founded on this extremely parochial type of thinking, where we look at the specific things that we find in our universe. We look at what we are used to. We look at what we know can exist. We look at what we have examples of. And we set those things up as the gold standards for what is special or what is significant. And if we don't have those things, if we say, oh, in this universe, you wouldn't have life. Okay, but what would you have? And by what grounds are you saying that that thing would be less complex or interesting or significant than life? Other universes might have other types of life, or they might have something that we wouldn't even call life. And they also might be empty voids. I'm not trying to claim that all universes would have something like life. They might be empty voids. We don't know. We have no idea. So you can't make this type of argument. Imagine that you have a much smaller range of universes, space of universes. Imagine you've got, 10 universes. And in one of the universes, the laws of nature, say, permit basic cellular life. And one of the universes, you get to ants. In another one of the universes, you get to monkeys. In another one of the universes, you get to humans. And in another one of the universes, you get to alien life that is 1,000,000 times as complex and significant and much more deeply conscious than we are, and better in every meaningful, relevant way. Now, if you had some disembodied, dispassionate observer looking at each of these universes, if you had one observer for each universe, in the universe with the cells, an observer within that universe who had no access to any other universes would look at it and say, wow, look how incredible and intricate and well-designed these cells are, these countless billions and trillions of molecules all working together to generate, this amazing form of life. And in the universe with the ants, an observer that only had access to that universe would say, wow, look at these ants, and so incredible. They're so well designed, and look at these incredible senses of sight and smell that they have. And you know where I'm going. Every universe would have, an observer in it would have, a little Dr. Craig in it saying, wow, this universe is so special. This universe really must require some special explanation, because it's so much better than the other universes. But the problem here is that if you just have one universe, if you only have your universe and you claim it's designed, then you don't know what an undesigned universe looks like. You cannot claim that other universes would lead to more or less complexity. The idea of if you started with different constants of nature and you'd get different laws as a result, that you would be able to predict to any meaningful extent what would happen in that universe, then even if you go online and search for things like Conway's Game of Life is one of my favorite examples, then we have plenty of examples in science and in mathematics of complex, ordered systems arising from a few basic rules.
A dart randomly thrown at the range of values would, in all probability, strike a life-prohibiting universe.
Yes. It would, in all probability, strike a universe that prohibits the type of life we see here. It might even strike a universe that prohibits any type of life. Would it strike a universe that prohibits any type of more complex, any type of similarly complex or more complex systems than we find here? That is impossible to say. I would love to hear Dr. Craig give me an example of a specific set of constants that he knows wouldn't be able to generate any meaningful or complex systems.
He agrees that it's not plausible to explain the fine-tuning by physical necessity. So that means if he's going to deny design, he's going to have to advert to the chance hypothesis.
No, the options that Dr. Craig has given are not necessarily exhaustive. You can't just say, here are 3 options that I've thought of, and if you don't go with option A or B, then the conclusion must be C.
Here he says, but even if we do find the much-needed explanation, it will be disastrous for the fine-tuning argument because it would disconfirm God's existence. After all, a benevolent God would want to create the physical laws so that life-conducive universes would be overwhelmingly likely.
Now, this is a shocking claim on Halvorson's part. In fact, I think it's crazy.
Here it is again.
Why does he think that if God exists, that God would create a universe in which fine-tuning is probable on naturalism? I can't think of any reason God would do such a thing. Why not create a universe in which fine-tuning is probable on theism, but improbable on naturalism? Maybe God wanted to leave evidence.
Yeah, that's a great point. Why doesn't God make the universe in such a way that it's clear that these phenomena we observe couldn't be explained properly under naturalism and would require theism to be explained? It's funny that Dr. Craig clearly seems to think this is a good idea, but every phenomenon that we've ever investigated has turned out to have a naturalistic explanation that explains it better and more accurately than theism. But when it comes to things that we don't understand yet, like fine-tuning, then the explanation is, oh, well, yeah, no, we can't explain this because God obviously would want to make these phenomena in such a way that it's clearly due to theism and not naturalism. This is a perfect example of the flexibility of theism. If you investigate some particular aspect of the way that nature works or the way that nature is, and you find out that the explanation is naturalistic, then, oh yeah, well, God made it that way, and God is just a brilliant designer. If you investigate something, or you're in the process of investigating something, like the reason that the constants have the values that they do, and you haven't come across a naturalistic explanation yet, then it's, oh yeah, well, it's theism, because God is clearly trying to show us, he's trying to send us a message that the best explanation here is theism. But of course, if we discover one day, were we to hypothetically discover someday, that all of these constants sprung from a more basic, single, fundamental aspect or fact about the universe, then I guarantee that people like Dr. Craig would just jump right back to, oh yeah, well, it's all explainable by naturalism. But really, all of that just shows you that God is even smarter and more wonderful than we thought.
And so, by creating a universe that, in all probability, would never have evolved life if God did not exist, God has left remarkable evidence of his existence in nature.
Then why did he not leave this evidence in the origin of species, which we now know has a perfectly good naturalistic explanation? Isn't it funny how God is leaving the evidence of his existence in all of the phenomena that we don't fully understand yet? God used to be leaving evidence of his existence in phenomena that we didn't understand, like the origin of species, or the behavior of the tides, or the movement of the stars and planets. But now that we understand those, oh yeah, those are natural, but these things we don't understand yet, oh yeah, no, that's where God is really leaving us evidence.
So I find Halverson's claim here to be just bizarre.
Fourth time.
This is what Kevin Sharp, in my dialogue with him at Ohio State University a few years ago, called divine psychology. And Halverson is indulging here a little bit of divine psychology and saying that if God existed, he would create a universe in which fine-tuning would be highly probable on naturalism.
Isn't divine psychology like everything that people such as Dr. Craig do? The foundation of his argument here rests on him saying that if God exists, he would be likely to create a finely tuned universe. The whole idea that in theism, God would create a finely tuned universe with greater likelihood than random chance would in a naturalistic universe is entirely trying to predict what God would do, considering that these arguments are all based on things that God does. And God doesn't do anything necessarily. God can do whatever he wants. So the things that do happen in a theistic universe are entirely based on God's choices. Then every argument like this, the Kalam cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the argument from, universal morality, all of these arguments are entirely based on divine psychology.
He says the fine-tuning argument rests on an interesting discovery of physical cosmology, that the odds were strongly stacked against life. But if God exists, then the odds didn't have to be stacked this way. These bad odds could themselves be taken as evidence against the existence of God.
He's right that God is at liberty to create any sort of universe that he wants, a finely tuned universe or a universe that is not finely tuned. But the fact that the odds would be stacked against life given naturalism is not in any way a disconfirmation of God's existence. On the contrary, as I explained, it would actually be evidence of God's existence. That a universe exists which is so enormously improbable given naturalism, but not improbable given theism, since, as Halverson says, God is at liberty to create any sort of universe that he wants.
Okay, I'm not sure if I misunderstood something there, or if maybe Dr. Craig misunderstood the question, but that didn't sound like an answer. The point raised by Halverson was that under a theistic universe, then if God wanted to create life, he would not have created life balanced on this knife's edge of constants, which allowed, life to arise in a specific corner of the universe. God would have created life in a much less precarious and haphazard way. This was actually expressed, I think, a little more generally by Sean Carroll in his debate with Dr. Craig back in 2014, where Dr. Carroll said that under theism, you wouldn't need life to depend on all of these physical constants. You wouldn't need all of these different factors to come together in just the right way, in just the right part of the universe, at just the right time in the universe's age, where life springs up in, particular places on the surface of this particular planet some of the time. You would just have life, and whether or not the universe had natural laws at all, or whether those natural laws supported life, would be irrelevant. You wouldn't need that under theism, so it would be very unlikely. As far as I can tell, Craig didn't really answer that. He just sort of said, well, fine-tuning is unlikely under naturalism, so that's evidence for God.
This is Kevin Sharp's point about divine psychology.
What God would do.
Yeah, how do we know what kind of universe God would create if he exists? But that actually serves to undercut Halverson's argument, I think, because while you can say that embodied conscious agents are highly improbable on naturalism, you can't say they're improbable on theism, precisely because you can't do divine psychology. There isn't any way that you can assert that this is highly improbable.
No. The fact that you can't say what the probability is under theism doesn't mean it's higher than naturalism. I don't know is not the same thing as it's 50-50. Just saying, well, we don't know what the probability is under theism, but we know that it's very low on naturalism, so, it's better for theism. No, it's not. That just means you don't know. It just means you can't make the comparison. I can't stress this enough. I don't know if A or B does not mean there's a 50% chance of A and a 50% chance of B.
He wraps it up by saying, one could go too far with this sort of skepticism. Surely the so-called fine-tuning evidence is proof of something. But the fact that our current cosmology theory can't explain it tells us that we have more work to do. When our best science predicts a lifeless universe and this fails to obtain, what should we do? We could say a miracle has occurred, but that would be intellectually lazy. We need a theory that will make accurate predictions and integrate with other successful physical theories. The fine-tuning argument falls short because it assumes that our current cosmological theory is correct as long as we invoke as long as we invoke a non-scientific principle, God. I advocate a more radical and scientific reading of the fine-tuning data. It's not a brute fact or a true premise in a theological argument. Rather, it's evidence that we need a new and revolutionary cosmological theory.
Wow. Okay, so here's Halverson's alternative to design. It is that we need a new and revolutionary cosmological theory. He's advocating for some sort of fantasy physics that we don't have.
No. Anybody hearing Halverson's statement there can tell, like anybody who thinks about this can tell, that what Halverson is saying is that I don't think any of these explanations we currently have sufficiently explain this data. None of them explain why the constants are the way they are and why the universe appears fine-tuned. So I think that in order to explain it, we will need some bold new explanation that hopefully one day we'll come across. He's not saying, oh, I think it's this crazy new physics that we haven't discovered yet. He is trying to practice humility in saying that I don't think any of these quite work yet. We're going to need something else.
So this is a profoundly, I think, anti-scientific alternative. It's rooted in a kind of methodological naturalism that says there has to be a scientific explanation for fine-tuning, even if that requires a thoroughgoing revision of contemporary astrophysics and cosmology. And
saying that the explanation you've provided, which happens to be supernatural, is not sufficient, is not the same thing as saying, I will only accept natural arguments by definition. The problem with the fine-tuning argument, as put forward by Craig and others, isn't even that it's supernatural. It's that it doesn't provide any useful information beyond the information that it purports to explain. If I drop a ball and the ball falls to the ground, and I come up with two hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 says there's a force that pulls objects down towards the ground. That theory uses a general statement to make specific claims about the behavior and nature of stuff in the universe. The data that it's trying to explain, which was my ball falling to the ground, is a specific case of a general statement that the hypothesis makes. So the hypothesis can be used to make predictions. It has implications beyond just the thing that we just saw happened, and this is how it happened. We can drop more balls, and they add to that evidence because the claim is general. Whereas my second hypothesis, if I said the reason that that ball fell is because, well, there are these spirits, right? And they decided to come down and move that ball to the floor when I let go of it. That's a problem, because you're only making a claim about a specific event. The only evidence you have for your hypothesis is the data that you constructed your hypothesis to explain. It's not generalizable. It has no implications beyond stating what already happened in different words, and so it can't be tested. Whereas if you said, oh, there are these spirits, and every time someone drops a ball, for every ball that somebody holds up and lets go of, that's, say, between this and this radius, and that weighs this much, these spirits move those balls to the ground. That's fine, because now you've made a general statement of which the data you're trying to explain is just an example. You can test this. It has implications beyond this thing that happened. This is how explanations work in science, even for single events, because I know somebody out there is going to say, well, what about the single events that are explained in science, like the Big Bang? You're right, the Big Bang itself can't be repeated, but the explanation that we gave for the Big Bang, that, oh, this is how it happened, that there are these behaviors and these facts about nature that came into play, were general statements that had implications beyond just the Big Bang happened. They said, this is what the Big Bang was, and because of that, if we go out and measure the cosmic microwave background, then it will have a temperature of about 2.7 Kelvin. Because if this is the way that the Big Bang happened, this will be the result. This is what things like fine-tuning are missing. They have no further implications beyond the explanation that this thing happened, and we call the explanation God. It is functionally equivalent to having no explanation, in the sense that if you adopt this explanation of the why the constants have the values that they do, oh, there was a designer that tuned them, you have nothing more about how the universe works. You have no predictions to make. You have no implications about specific things in the universe that you can draw from that. You have no knowledge beyond the fact that you just gave a name to a process or an event that you do not understand any better now than you did before you came up with this explanation. That's why, aside from the bad logic and the parochialism and anthropocentrism of the arguments, they're just not useful even if you accept them.
And as to the best explanation of the fine-tuning, you could regard that, as I'm inclined to do, as a philosophical question, not a scientific question. I'm not proposing a new scientific theory to replace the current cosmological model. I, as a philosopher, am asking a metaphysical question that scientists are free to simply say, we don't have an explanation for this. We don't know what explains the fine-tuning. This is not a scientific question, they might say. Or if they come to a scientific dead end, they might just throw up their hands. But to offer some sort of a fantasy physics as an alternative to theism, I think, is desperate.
Here's the problem with trying to play both sides of the field in the way that Dr. Craig is here, is that this isn't a philosophical question. You're making claims about the nature of the universe, the physical universe. You're making claims about the constants of nature, the force of gravity, the rate of expansion of the universe. You can't just say, I have an explanation for why the universe is the way it is, and it's supported by the scientific data. But it's not a theory. It's not a scientific question. It's a philosophical question. If you have a claim about reality that is more likely under one set of data than it is under another set of data, Like, for instance, Dr. Craig here saying, oh, I have this idea, this fine-tuning idea, this designer idea, where we have scientific data now about the fundamental constants, the measurement of, say, the Hubble constant and other things, a fine structure constant. Where given this scientific data, my claim is more likely. The scientific data is evidence for my claim. Once you've stepped into that zone, you have admitted that scientific data can weaken or strengthen your claims. That's a hypothesis.
Bill, I wonder if he's afraid of God of the gaps in this whole thing.
Yes, that seems evident. The way he characterizes it, we could just say a miracle occurred, when in fact the proponents of the fine-tuning argument, like Robin Collins and others, are offering an argument based upon confirmation theory, probability calculus, and saying that the...
I would love to see the probability calculus for how likely it is that God would want to create life in a theistic universe. I would really love to see how you evaluate the specific probabilities of what God would want to do.
The fine-tuning of the universe or embodied conscious agents are much more probable on theism than they are on atheism, and therefore these lend confirmation to the hypothesis of theism over atheism.
Okay, I thought this wasn't a scientific hypothesis, but maybe he just misspoke there, but he just called theism a hypothesis. I don't even have that much else to say about that video. Just try to keep in mind that, number one, we have no reason to believe that the laws of nature could have been any different. Number two, we don't know what an undesigned universe looks like. And related, number three, we don't know what any other set of constants would produce. We have no reference for this. We have no idea whether it could be way better or more complex than life. It could be less complex than life. And bonus number four, we have no reason to expect that under theism, the universe would look like this. Under theism, the universe would look like it was actually designed for life. You wouldn't have all of these different values and constants coming together in such a way so that after some long time, in some tiny speck of the universe, in some ways, on some parts of this planet, some of the time, you could get life. So under theism, this is not the universe that you would expect to see. Anyway, thanks for watching if you watched. Later.